Welcome to this week's Who the Folk podcast. I'm Lonnie Goldsmith, the editor of TCG Folk. This week I talked to Liz Sawyer, the City of Minneapolis police and public safety reporter for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. We talk about the importance of her beat at the newspaper, what led her into journalism, and what it was that led her to convert to Judaism on this week's Who the Folk podcast. But before we talk to Liz, Hanukkah starts this week, and we have newly designed Hanukkah-themed merch for you and your whole family, and you will love it a lotka. You'll look good, and you'll help support Jewfolk at the same time. Check it out at tcjewfolk.com/store. Liz Sawyer, welcome to the Who the Folk podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
I should have done my homework before, but I believe this might be the first time over the course of this podcast we have had both a husband and wife on as guests at different times. Previously spoke to your husband, Aaron Levinsky, Star Tribune photographer, and you also work at the Star Tribune with him as well as a reporter. Currently, your beat is the Minneapolis public safety.
Yeah,
just the Minneapolis side, right? Mm-hmm. And I know you've, like anybody at a newspaper, you have various beats at various times. This is certainly in the last few years, I would think, been an interesting time to be covering that world. How is it as a police reporter? I've talked to other people, I've worked with other people who have been doing that kind of work before. How are you finding it?
It's really tough. I mean, covering the city post George Floyd's murder, and even before George Floyd's murder, and the city in transition has been very difficult. People are still so raw from everything that happened. There's a lot of open wounds here. I mean, my God, the old third precinct is still standing, surrounded by razor wire. These feelings 3.5 years later have not been healed. So I'm still covering a lot of gun violence and public safety stuff, but I cover the police department as an institution. So looking at how they're going to navigate these now dueling consent decrees, the state human rights department, is forcing them to undertake some serious sweeping reforms. And then the DOJ has come in and made their ruling, and eventually they will also have their own requirements.
Right.
So it's going to take a lot of work to turn this department around, particularly when they lost, 300 officers, and rebuild a abysmal community trust.
Right. I mean, I think that's one of the things you hear the most is that you see it because you're in the middle of it, covering it, but myself as a reader and not a Minneapolis resident, in the interest of full disclosure, so I have, certainly far less dog in this fight than many of the listeners might, but it's just the massive trust deficit that they're working from. And it goes back well beyond George Floyd as well. At a time, incidents that happened where I'm sure you weren't covering them at that time, but there's so much to make up for that I don't totally know how you can.
Yeah, George Floyd was certainly not the first or the last unarmed black person that was killed at the hands of police. Right. There have been a number of fatal police shootings by this department since then. Mm-hmm. George Floyd's murder was particularly painful because of Darnella Fraser's video. It had never been broadcast live in that way, and just all of the elements that created that story in the midst of COVID, people were forced to pay attention in a way that sometimes police shootings, the news cycle moves on and people don't pay attention. They were forced to pay attention with George Floyd. And then of course, the unrest and everything that came after the fact, that was a uniquely horrible situation. And I hope that we never experience a tragedy like that in the city again.
The news cycle moving on, it's because of the video that people weren't able to, but people were able to watch the video in real time because of social media. And social media has made the news cycle just move exponentially fast. It is like hours long at best usually far less than that. How hard is it to report when you know that people's attention span is a headline that most of the time they don't even click through to?
It's really difficult, and I mean I wish we could just shut down the internet half the time. I mean I've stopped. I'm not nearly as active on Twitter or X or whatever the hell we're calling it now.
Yeah.
I found that medium is no longer helpful.
Yeah.
I used to be able to engage with readers in a meaningful way, and that just doesn't exist anymore. It's a lot more hostile. During 2020, both with COVID and with George Floyd, I was tweeting in real time. I was out on the street and providing live updates, and I think in that moment it was helpful. Everything since then has not been. And so I focus a lot less these days about what people are saying on social, and I try and focus so much more on providing more enterprise, in-depth coverage in the newspaper. Yeah. And hopefully if people want to provide feedback, they'll write a letter to the editor or send me an email or give me a call, like,
right.
The Stone Ages, rather than tweeting some diatribe at me, because I'm probably not going to look at that. Yeah. Reporting in the social media age is difficult because sometimes you'll really want to talk to someone for a story, and they'll say, I'm not ready yet, and I'd love to talk to you next week. And what they don't understand sometimes is, like, I need it now, and I would love to follow up, and sometimes I can, but the public might have moved on by next week.
That's right.
And that's the sad reality of sort of this constant 24-hour news cycle.
It's a bombardment all the time, and it comes so fast. And it leaves just as fast sometimes.
Yeah.
Which, I mean, one of the things I really appreciate that you just said was the fact that you try to do the more in-depth enterprising pieces rather than, there are times for, like, the quick hitting, this happened. Nuts and bolts, inverted pyramid, just like your J school professor taught you to write a news story, and that's it.
Right.
But a lot of times, because, fortunately, with online is like you can write a little bit longer and maybe a larger piece fits better online than it does in print.
Yeah.
Obviously at JUFOC we don't have that, issues of like news holes to fill or anything like that, which is great. So yeah, we could maybe write 2,000 words when maybe, 1,000 could do, but that's okay. Sometimes it's, going long is worth it, and finding the extra sources and pulling more detail out into a story. But that's not always possible.
Yeah. That's the benefit of not working in TV. And I think TV has its time and place, and sometimes there are things in the visual medium that just work so much better. But the reason I went into print journalism, other than the fact that I didn't want people to recognize me on the street, I'm not interested in being judged by my appearance every day, like my friends who are in TV journalism. It's unfair and sexist. But for me, I like the idea of having the resources and the ability to go long. And I often talk to my TV friends and they say, man, I'm so jealous that like you were able to do this cover story in 1,200 words and I got 30 seconds, and you just don't have the ability to penetrate the story in the way that you want to and provide the nuance. And that is the benefit of print or online.
Right. There'll be, I was talking with a colleague in the Jewish communal space yesterday about press event that they put together for the Jewish community and Ukrainian community support. Your colleague Reed was there, wrote a great story from that event. But the story that we wrote and the story that Reed wrote was basically it. Like, there's a bunch of TV cameras there, but it was like 15 seconds of the anchor talking over video, and it was boom on to the next thing.
Yeah.
And it, like, I get it, but it's also really frustrating as a consumer to see, like, well, wait, there's got to be more to it than that. There's got to be more than like a 15 or 30 second soundbite that as a journalist you can give.
Yeah, and I imagine it's frustrating for them too. for the TV journalists, because they often would love more time, I'm sure, but that's just what they're beholden to, is that segment spot and whatever their managers determine its worth.
Right.
And, sometimes I write longer than I'm allowed to, and,
Sure,
and it gets cut too.
Absolutely.
But I do think that newspapers, one of the benefits is that you can provide a more diverse variety of perspectives and have the space to do it.
So what was it that got you into journalism in the first place?
I'm a really nosy person. I've always been that way since I was a kid.
Okay.
I was the kid who would unintentionally play 20 questions with their friends and then really annoy them. Journalism gives you an excuse to ask all of these questions, these personal questions that you would never normally have the right to.
Yep.
And my dad was a sports writer for the Oakland Press in Michigan for a time. He actually writes horror novels on the side just for funsies.
That's awesome.
He's just full of great ideas, and I always loved to write. I was really into it, and so as a high schooler, I was debating between taking an advanced math class, which I was never particularly good at, and going to join the student newspaper, and I chose the latter, and I have never looked back since. I'm one of those people who by 16 I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I set a path to do it, and I've never really considered doing anything else.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
For me, it was 6, but but yeah. Similarly though, I always knew I wanted to be a sports writer. And obviously, I realized, once I got into college, that everybody in the J school also wanted to be a sports writer. So
I wanted to be a sports writer, and then at some point in college, I'd been on that track. I was a sports columnist in high school. I was an athlete, and I was like, I'm going to break into this man's world of being a female sports reporter. And then I don't know how it happened, but I started chasing ambulances and got into news. And not the most uplifting subject often, but I've always sort of been drawn to public safety in that way and how people respond to it.
Because public safety, I think people respond how they do in a way because it's something that affects everybody.
Yeah. It's deeply traumatizing when you're exposed to such violence. And a lot of what I cover is ripple effects of gun violence.
Yeah.
And I think the things that keeps me doing it is that these mothers are so resilient. Yeah. It's amazing how people are able to pick up the pieces when they lose a loved one. And I want to share those stories because I think those people are remarkable. They make something good out of a horrible tragedy. They start a nonprofit. They start advocating at the legislature. I find it so inspirational.
It is that. And also, I would think there are times where you just got to come home at the end of the day you've been put through the ringer.
Yeah. Sometimes you cry in the shower. You got to do what you got to do.
Absolutely. It's hard. It's hard work. Lots of jobs are hard work, obviously. But talking to people at their lowest, their most painful moments, and asking them to, relive, without asking, the how are you feeling? Right. Of course you're feeling terrible, but how do you get beyond that? When you talk to somebody and then tell that story is really hard work. It's something that, I've been doing this a long time, and it's, when I have to talk to people in those moments, it's still really hard stories to tell.
You have to show real compassion.
Yeah.
And this is not the kind of beat that most people want to do. Actually, most of my colleagues would rather do anything than the beat that I do. And it's funny because I would rather do this than cover education. Yeah. But it's only because I think this is so important. Because public safety has a ripple effect on everything, every facet of your life. Right. And I internalize it. It is really hard to talk to people, but sometimes I'm constantly shocked by how many people want to talk about their grief and trauma. Because I don't know that if I was in their exact situation, I would be willing or able to do so. But the people who do open up and are generally so grateful that someone is willing to share their story, and it can be very therapeutic for them to sit down and, have that story be told to a broader audience.
That is part of the reason, almost to a T, that I like, even if it's not somebody who's passed away in that kind of a traumatic circumstance, I really enjoy talking to people for obituaries. Mm-hmm. And why, when I have interns, for example, I really hope I'm able to assign one to them, because it is unbelievably challenging writing. Mm-hmm. You're talking to people who, whether it's somebody who tragically, lost a child through gun violence or just natural causes, to somebody who's, over 100 years old. You got to talk to their family. It's hard to get people to open up, but when you do, though, it's, I think, some of the best writing I've done.
It's really
telling
rewarding.
Those stories. It's really rewarding.
I think it's some of the most heartfelt journalism I've done, actually, is obits. And no one would think that based on like projects and whatever, but those are the ones that mean the most to me often. And if it's like a person who lived a long life, who didn't die in a horrific way, it's not hard to get people to rave about their loved ones, but it's really hard to compact a life into 500 words.
Right.
That's really difficult. So figuring out, beyond their job, who they are, who they were, is a challenging but rewarding task.
Right. I mean, fortunately, I don't have the 500 word. I mean, maybe I should give myself that kind of cutoff. But, I did a piece on the 111-year-old woman who went by the name of Grandma Ruth, who was a longtime volunteer at Temple Israel.
I also wrote about Grandma
Did you read? Right.
See, I think she was only 108 when I wrote my story.
Unfortunately, I didn't get to write about her while she was still with us. But getting to talk to Rabbi Zimmerman and talk to the former principal at the elementary school she also volunteered at, and talk to the people at the preschool, it was like, oh, I was angry at myself that I didn't get to meet her when she was alive. And it's things like that it's like, oh, I love getting to tell this person's story, because she clearly touched so many people in the community.
Yeah, she was a remarkable woman, and I still have her matzo ball soup recipe.
Do you?
Yeah. Someone emailed me for it out of the blue the other day.
Really?
Yeah, and I wrote that story years ago, and I had to pull it up. I had to find it, dig it out, and I was like, now I need to make this, because I don't know if I ever tried her recipe, and I'm always on the hunt for a good matzo ball soup.
Yeah. What, have you made it yet?
Not yet. I got to do that.
Okay.
Maybe for Hanukkah or something.
There you go. It's a good time.
Anytime. Shabbos.
Any time is a good time for matzo ball soup. But particularly as we're getting into the winter, it's like, it feels a little more right.
Yeah.
For sure. So, one of the things that I know Aaron had mentioned, and you and I spoke about before we started recording, was that you converted to Judaism. And I told you when we spoke that was something that it was, like, people's why is always really interesting to me. And I think that's me also being a nosy journalist. But also, I've grown up and lived it my entire life. And so what was it that brought you to Judaism, and I guess how was your conversion experience? Because it's one of those things I always like talking to people about if they're willing.
Yeah. Well, I never intended to convert.
Okay.
It's an interesting story. I mean, I didn't have a great relationship with religion growing up.
Okay.
I was raised in a Protestant household, but my family wasn't particularly religious. We went through the motions. We went to church on Sundays. And when I was like 9, the congregation split because the pastor was leaving for another church. And so half of the congregation went with him and half stayed. And it was from a non-denominational one. And we followed, thinking, we like this guy. And the new church was a little strange. It was much more strict, and they employed all these new rules that we had not seen before. And my dad was, starting on his side hustle of writing fiction. He writes horror novels, sort of Stephen King-esque books. And his first book had come out, self-published, and, it was a typical thriller.
Right.
And certain members of the congregation, including the pastor, were very upset about it. They thought that it was, inappropriate.
Okay.
Because it had sex and swear words and all this stuff.
Swearing and violence
yeah,
and all the things,
he's like, have you not read the Bible? So, we didn't have great experiences there, and we were getting ready to leave the church, and that's when we found out that this pastor who we had followed had been embezzling from the church. And so we were like, it's okay. So by 11 years old, I was sort of done with the idea of organized religion, and was fine with being agnostic, like the rest of my life. Yeah. So anyway, fast forward 20 years, I met my now husband. My father-in-law is a conservative rabbi. I started to experience Judaism for the first time through his family. Mm-hmm. And it was important to them, and I wanted to learn. So I agreed to take a intro class, and I met Rabbi Harold Kravitz at Adath. Mm-hmm. Really fell in love with the cultural stuff, and we had prepared his family. We had told them, she's probably not going to convert, just so you know. And then so when I decided that I really had fallen in love with the culture and the religion as a whole, it was a happy surprise for them, of course. But really the main thing that did it for me was that my whole religious experience growing up was that there was only one way. Yeah. There was one right answer. And I was the kid, I distinctly remember, at 9 years old, arguing with them about things that didn't make sense to me.
That totally tracks.
And I'm just a very opinionated person, which I, of course, try and keep out of my journalism. But,
sure.
I will argue. And so this whole idea of, 2 Jews, 3 opinions was super, appealing to me.
It's very on the nose for you.
I loved it. And so I was like, oh, there's 1,000 right answers.
Yeah.
As long as you're engaging in it, you're not really wrong.
Right.
And so I loved that, and I just found a community that I had never found before. So that was my journey, and it took years. I mean, it was a 4-year process where I was thinking about it before I actually converted in 2021.
See, I know there are plenty of people who convert for their spouse or partner, or choose not to, despite and it's a discussion, it's private discussion, it's your private thing, and you do what you do. Certainly I have no judgment. I mean, I'm sure plenty of people do, but that's their problem. But I kind of like that you sort of prepped his family, and then they're like, no, you sort of came to it on your own, not because of, you didn't feel like you needed to.
Yeah, I mean, I think I was never anti doing it. And, my grandma, I always joke that my grandma was cool, glad you found any God. She's a spiritual person, and I think just the idea of us being religious, whatever that may be,
right,
was cool with her. My family was very supportive about it, but they don't know a lot about Judaism, but I one day hope that, maybe they can be at our table for Pesach and sort of understand why this is so meaningful for us. The main thing with my family was that Christmas, which is not religious for them at all, it's really more of a meaningful family holiday. They didn't want me to lose out on Christmas.
Okay.
And so the idea of us not having a Christmas tree in the house, for example, was hard for them to wrap their mind around. But we go visit them, and we celebrate with them, and and then we do our own thing, and so they've been really supportive.
Right, they can do presents. You can do presents on Christmas, and then you can introduce them to Chinese food for dinner, and everybody gets Christmas.
Our children will get all of the holidays.
That's right.
Be great.
Right. No, I think that's really. think it's a cool way to come to it. And yeah, I don't think there's one right. I've talked to a lot of people who have gone through the process. I'm not sure there's like one right way to do it. Much like the rest of Judaism, there's you do the parts of it that work for you. I'm sure a rabbi's going to hear this and be like, "No, honey, you're doing this way wrong."
I mean, there's a lot of things I do wrong, but my trip to Israel last year was so eye-opening for me that there are so many different ways to engage in Judaism, and I love and appreciate my in-laws' way, but I've come to find my own way, and Aaron and I are still learning and still figuring out what that will look like for our future family.
Yeah.
But I'm coming into my own with it. I still have a lot to learn, but I feel connected to a spiritual community in a way that I never have, and that's been, I'm super grateful for it.
You will always learn. That's the thing. It's like, I know that I, again, been in this my whole life. I'm constantly learning. So that's part of it. I mean, that's also, very much part of Judaism is the study and the learning and the exploration. Nothing is ever static.
Yeah.
I suppose unless you want it to be. But I think for the most part, it's not. I think most people appreciate that it's not. Mm-hmm. So your trip to Israel, what was that? I also took my first trip to Israel earlier this year. So,
oh, really?
Yes.
Oh, I assumed you'd been like a million times.
No, first time. What was your experience like?
So I went in, excuse me, September of 2022, and I went on the very last, what I'm calling the old person birthright trip, which was the 28 to 32 age range, and I got in at the last second. Randomly, a childhood friend of mine also converted at the same time I did in Detroit.
Okay.
Like, totally random, not for a partner. She just fell in love with it taking a world religion class, and we reconnected after, 10 years.
That's amazing.
And went on this trip together, which was so cool.
Yes.
And, I mean, it's one thing to read about Israel.
Yeah.
And the Holy Land in general. And it's another thing to be there. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the first things that was so eye-opening is how diverse it is. Because based on how some people talk about Israel in this country, you would think that it's all white people, and it is obviously not.
Right.
And I don't know. I just met a lot of different kinds of Jews. And I was also struck by how many people had tattoos over there, which was surprising to me, given how people feel about tattoos sometimes.
Sometimes, yes.
And I myself got a tattoo in Tel Aviv.
Nice.
A Jewish tattoo in Hebrew. So I grew a lot on that trip, and it was really meaningful for me to be at the wall, to see some of these sites, and practice Judaism in a new way.
Yeah. No, I totally get that. Had a lot of really interesting conversations with people on the trip. I was on the Minneapolis Jewish Federation trip back in April. And, there's some people who very much are like, Tel Aviv is their sort of center of their Israeli world. And there are some for whom Jerusalem is, and for some it's just Israel in general. And it was just really interesting talking to people and sort of, again, it's coming back to being the journalist. It's like hearing their why. Mm-hmm. It was just it just made for such a rich experience in that way. And, just walking around and having, I had the best falafel of my life at basically a gas station bodega.
Yeah. The shawarma was incredible.
The shawarma was incredible. The food is incredible. The smells, the sights, I sort of figured, Shabbat in Tel Aviv, it would be, a very sort of chill, but you couldn't get a spot on the beach because it was packed. I learned it's what they do. Saturday afternoon, everybody goes to the beach. Everybody was at the beach. It was amazing to see. And it was just, just everybody hanging out together. You hear Hebrew, you hear Arabic, you hear all kinds of languages. It's just people out and about, minding their own business, doing their own thing.
The people were so friendly, and but also so argumentative. And it reminded me of kind of New Yorkers, where like they'd give you the shirt off your back, but they'll also like, spend 2 hours arguing about some single point.
Right.
And I just loved that. And I felt like, oh, wow, these are my people.
Well, that is it's cool that you got to have that experience right before they brought the age back down.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I wish that they would keep that age range, because it was fun to see. I think that when you're younger, probably there's more of an emphasis from the kids maybe about partying in these new places, or so I've heard. For us, I mean, I'm sure some of that was going on, but it was more the relationship building between, people in their late 20s and early 30s was, we're all young professionals, and we all had such diverse upbringings. Yeah. There were a lot of people who were Jewish by blood, actually, but had never really went through the motions or were raised in interfaith households, or didn't know anything about it at all. And so watching everybody learn and take it in was really fun.
It's like all of you had the sort of light bulb moment.
Yeah.
Probably at different times, and I know I had lots of those on that trip, but you sort of hear about it, you read about it, and you learn about it, and it's no substitute for actually experiencing.
Yeah.
Which is pretty awesome.
I wish more people would go before they have their hot takes.
Yeah, but then they wouldn't be hot takes, would they? They would just be people talking.
That's true.
It's no fun if you can't. It's no fun if you can't yell about it.
If you're actually informed.
God, if more people are actually informed. What a world. Yeah. Oh, Liz, last couple questions, and we will let you get back on the beat, because I'm sure work always calls. I know it does for me. First, what is your favorite Jewish holiday?
Pesach, for sure.
Okay. How come?
I think the community of it, it's so personal, sitting at these tables with your family and friends, and the way that you can individualize your Seder. Yeah. I've been to Seders that were an hour. I've been to Seders that were 5 hours. Some of the Seders I've attended, people will print out little poems and supplements to their Haggadah. I really just find it so beautiful. Yeah. And, who doesn't love 4 glasses of wine? So
that helps, especially at a 5-hour Seder.
Yeah.
That's for sure. And finally, what is your favorite Jewish food?
Matzo ball soup, for sure, hands down.
Is there any ones in particular you found yet that really stands out for you?
I like to go to Crossroads.
Okay.
In, what is that, St. Louis Park?
Minnetonka.
Minnetonka?
Yes, Minnetonka.
I like their soup. When I'm feeling lazy, I will go and just get a couple quarts of that and bring it home.
And it freezes well.
It does.
Matzo ball soup always freezes well.
Yeah. But I haven't perfected my own recipe yet, so I'm working on that. So if any of you have suggestions, I would happily take them.
Oh, I'm sure people will have suggestions, and they can email them to you. Probably don't tweet them at you, though, because you may not get it.
Yeah.
Liz Sawyer, this was a blast. Thank you so much for coming on. I really appreciate it, and best of luck to you out in the big city, covering very important topics that reach a lot of people. So thank you. Yeah. The Who the Folk podcast is a part of the Jew Folk Podcast Network and a product of Jew Folk Inc. Please subscribe, rate, and review wherever you get your podcasts. If you have suggestions for other podcast guests, please email them to me at editor@tcjewfolk.com. For our other shows, check out tcjewfolk.com/podcast.